Pick up anything heavy right now. A book, a mug, a water bottle, anything. Hold it in your hand and swing it at a table. Go ahead, just a light tap. Notice how the force of the impact travels up your wrist, into your forearm, into your elbow. Now imagine swinging that object for 8 hours. Imagine swinging it hard enough to cut through a living tree trunk, a trunk that is fighting you every inch, closing its grain around your blade, bouncing your strikes back at you, refusing to fall. Now imagine doing that with a sharpened rock held in your bare fist, no handle, no grip, nothing between your skin and the impact except your own knuckles and willpower. For over 1,000,000 years, that was the only option. Your ancestors held a sharp stone in their hand and hit things with it until something gave, usually the stone, sometimes the tree, occasionally their hand. And then, at some point, someone wrapped a piece of wood around a piece of rock, tied it tight, and swung it. And the world changed. Not slowly, not in some abstract philosophical sense. The forests fell, the fields appeared, the animals were butchered faster, the shelters were built stronger, the enemies died quicker. Everything that followed, every farm, every wooden ship, every log cabin, every civilization that fed itself from cleared land, traces back to that moment. A rock on a stick. The most underestimated invention in human history. So, how did we actually get from a stone in the fist to an axe in the hand? The story starts earlier than you think. Much earlier. And it does not start with us. In 2011, a team led by Christopher Lepre at Rutgers University published a paper in Nature that pushed the oldest known hand axes back to approximately 1.76 million years ago. They were found at a site called Kokisalai on the western shore of Lake Turkana in Kenya. But calling them axes is generous. These were Acheulean hand axes, teardrop-shaped stones, bifacially flaked, roughly the size of your hand, held directly in the palm. No handle, no binding, no composite engineering. Just a rock shaped with patient deliberation into something that fit the hand and could cut, scrape, chop, and dig. And the creatures making them were not Homo sapiens. They were Homo erectus, a hominin species with a brain about 2/3 the size of yours, who walked upright, controlled fire, and somehow figured out that if you chip away the edges of a stone in a symmetrical pattern, you get a tool that can do almost anything. Think about what that means for the question you came here for. The axe, or at least its ancestor, predates our species by nearly 1.5 million years. Homo sapiens showed up roughly 300,000 years ago. Acheulean hand axes were already 1.4 million years old by then. We did not invent the hand axe, we inherited it. And when we arrived, the design was so good that we kept using it for hundreds of thousands more years. And when I say the design did not change, I mean it barely changed at all. The Acheulean hand axe tradition lasted from roughly 1.76 million years ago to about 100,000 years ago. That is 1.6 million years of the same basic tool, the same teardrop shape, the same bifacial flaking technique, the same form showing up in East Africa, in India, in Europe, in the Near East. Shanti Papu and colleagues published findings in Science in 2011 showing Acheulean hand axes at Atirampakam in southern India dating to roughly 1.5 million years ago. The design crossed continents. It crossed species. Homo erectus made it. Homo heidelbergensis made it. Early Homo sapiens made it. For longer than most species exist on this planet, somebody, somewhere, was picking up a rock and shaping it into that same familiar form. Now, here is something worth pausing on. The person who first identified these tools for what they were was ridiculed for decades. In the 1830s and 1840s, a French customs official named Jacques Boucher de Perches started finding hand axes in gravel beds near Abbeville in northern France. He published his arguments in a book called Antiquités celtiques et antediluviennes in 1847, claiming these were tools made by ancient humans. The scientific establishment told him he was wrong. They said the stones were natural formations. They said no humans existed that far back. It took until 1859, the same year Darwin published On the Origin of Species, for British geologists Joseph Prestwich and John Evans to visit the sites, examine the evidence, and confirm that Boucher de Perthes had been right all along. The entire field of prehistoric archaeology was born because a customs officer refused to stop picking up rocks. But here is the thing about Acheulean hand axes. They were held in the hand. That is both their strength and their fatal limitation. When you grip a sharp stone directly and swing it into a tree trunk, every ounce of impact force travels straight back into your palm, your wrist, your joints. You cannot swing as hard as you want because your own body absorbs the shock. You cannot get enough leverage because your arm is short and your grip is limited. And the edge of the stone digs into your own skin every time you strike. A hand axe will chop through a branch. It will butcher an animal carcass. It will dig a root out of the ground. But it will not fell a large tree. Not efficiently. Not without destroying your hands in the process. For the axe to become the tool that reshaped the world, someone had to solve a problem that sounds simple, but is actually one of the most cognitively demanding things early humans ever attempted. They had to attach the stone to a handle. This is called hafting, and it changed everything. Think about what hafting actually requires because it is not as obvious as it looks from where we are standing. You need a stone head shaped specifically to sit in or against a wooden handle. Not any stone, not any handle. The stone has to be the right size, the right weight, the right shape. It has to have a groove, or a notch, or a flat surface that mates with the wood in a way that will not slip under impact. The handle has to be the right length to provide leverage, the right thickness to absorb shock, the right wood to flex without snapping. And then you have to join them. Not with a nail, not with a bolt, not with glue from a tube. You need binding material, sinew, or twisted plant fiber, or strips of wet rawhide that will shrink as they dry and lock down tight. And in many cases, you need adhesive, a glue, made from ingredients you have to gather, process, and combine in precise proportions. That last part, the adhesive, is where the story gets genuinely surprising. At Sibutu Cave in KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, archaeologist Lynn Wadley found something that changed how scientists think about the ancient mind. Stone tools dating to roughly 70,000 years ago showed traces of compound adhesive, a glue made by deliberately mixing plant gum with red ochre. The ochre was not decorative. It was a loading agent. Mixed into the gum in the right proportion, it made the adhesive stiffer and less brittle. Too much ochre, and it crumbled. Too little, and it was too soft to hold. Wadley published her analysis in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2010, and her argument is striking. Making this adhesive is not trial and error, it is chemistry. You have to understand that combining two substances with different properties creates a third substance with properties neither component has alone. You have to control your fire temperature while preparing multiple ingredients simultaneously. You have to plan ahead because the gum needs to be collected, the ochre needs to be ground, and the proportions need to be right before you even start the assembly. Wadley argued that this represents analogical reasoning, abstract thought, and enhanced working memory, cognitive capacities that overlap almost completely with what psychologists consider markers of fully modern human cognition. 70,000 years ago, someone was running a chemistry lab with rocks and tree sap and ochre, and they were doing it well enough to attach a stone blade to a wooden spear shaft so securely that it could survive the impact of piercing an animal's hide at full throwing force. And it was not just our species doing this. Neanderthals were making adhesive too, and they may have been doing it earlier. In 2017, Paul Kozowick and colleagues at Leiden University published experiments in scientific reports demonstrating that Neanderthals produced birch bark tar, the oldest known synthetic material in the archaeological record, as far back as roughly 200,000 years ago. The oldest fragments come from Campitello in Italy. Another well-known piece from Königsauer in Germany dates to approximately 80,000 years ago and actually shows tooth impressions. Someone was chewing the stuff, possibly to soften it for application. Birch bark tar is made by heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen, a process called pyrolysis. And here's the detail that caught researchers off guard. Kozowick's team tested multiple production methods and found that one of them, the condensation method, was surprisingly simple. You rolled a piece of birch bark, placed it near hot embers, and collected the tar that dripped out. No container needed, no complex setup. A Neanderthal sitting by a campfire could have produced enough birch bark tar to haft a stone tool in a single evening. So the technology for hafting, the adhesives, and the binding materials existed long before anyone built the first true axe. The oldest known twisted cord, the kind of cordage you would use to lash a stone head to a handle, comes from Abri du Maras in France. It is roughly 90,000 years old, and it was made by Neanderthals. Bruce Hardy at Kenyon College published that finding in Scientific Reports in 2020. The raw materials were there, the cognitive capacity was there, the adhesives were there. All that was missing was the specific application. Take a stone head designed for chopping and attach it to a wooden handle designed for leverage. Now, when exactly that happened is where the debate gets complicated, because wood rots. Handles disappear. What survives are the stone heads, and figuring out whether a stone head was used in the hand or hafted onto a stick requires careful analysis of wear patterns, adhesive residues, and fracture marks that most excavators did not think to look for until relatively recently. But here is what we do know. The oldest edge-ground stone axes in the world, real axes with ground cutting edges designed to be hafted onto handles, come from Majid Bebe, a rock shelter in Arnhem Land, in the Northern Territory of Australia, and they are 65,000 years old. Let that sit for a second. Chris Clarkson at the University of Queensland led the excavation, and the results were published in Nature in 2017. The team found ground edge hatchet heads in the deepest occupation layers of the site, alongside over 10,000 other artifacts. These axes were not just chipped into shape, their cutting edges were deliberately ground by rubbing the stone back and forth on a sandstone surface, creating a smooth, beveled edge that is sharper and more durable than a napped edge. The grinding process takes time and effort, but it produces a cutting surface that bites into wood cleanly instead of crushing and splitting the grain the way a chipped edge does. Now think about what that date means for the story of the axe. Edge-ground axes, the kind that actually work like the axes we would recognize today, appeared in Australia roughly 30,000 to 35,000 years before they appeared anywhere else on the planet. In Europe and the Near East, ground edge axes do not show up until the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 years ago. Aboriginal Australians were grinding axe edges 55,000 years before Europeans figured it out. That is not a small lead. That is an entire geological epoch of technological advantage in a single tool category. And those axes were almost certainly hafted. The shapes of the stone heads, the grinding patterns, the use wear, all consistent with tools designed to be mounted on handles. Aboriginal Australians were using hafted, ground-edge axes to cut bark for shelters, shape wooden tools, and clear small trees 65,000 years ago. This is some of the earliest evidence of systematic woodworking in human history, and it came from a continent that European colonizers would later describe as primitive. Now fast forward roughly 55,000 years. Europe and the Near East are finally catching up. During the Neolithic period, roughly 10,000 to 3000 BCE, polished stone axes became the defining technology of the age. And I mean that literally. The Neolithic, the New Stone Age, is named partly for this innovation, the shift from chipped stone tools to ground and polished stone tools. And the polished axe was the tool that made the Neolithic revolution possible. Here is why. Across northern and central Europe, the landscape was covered by dense deciduous forest. Oak, elm, lime, ash, covering the continent from the Atlantic coast to the Ural Mountains. If you wanted to farm, you had to clear those trees. And if you wanted to clear those trees, you needed an axe that could actually do it. Chipped flint tools were too fragile for sustained felling work. They shattered on hardwood. A polished stone axe, with its ground edge and smooth surface, could bite into an oak trunk and survive thousands of impacts. Experimental archaeology has shown that a polished Neolithic axe can fell a 30-centimeter diameter tree in roughly 15 to 20 minutes. That is comparable to an early metal axe. The tool was good enough. And the production of these axes was not casual. It was industrial. The Langdale Axe Factory in England's Lake District, is one of the most remarkable Neolithic sites in Europe. Located on the slopes of the Langdale Pikes, at elevations up to 800 meters, Neolithic people quarried a specific type of volcanic tuff, an extremely hard, fine-grained stone from the Borrowdale volcanic group. They roughed out axe blanks on site, up in the mountain mist, and then carried them down to lower elevations for the time-consuming process of grinding and polishing. Production lasted from roughly 4000 to 2500 BCE, over 1,500 years of continuous operation. Archaeologists, including Mark Edmonds at the University of York, have studied the site extensively, and the scale is genuinely surprising. This was not a few people chipping rocks in their spare time. This was organized, large-scale production of a tool that was in demand across an entire island. And the demand was enormous. Chemical fingerprinting using petrographic analysis to match the mineral composition of finished axes to their source rock has shown that Langdale axes were traded across all of England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. Some traveled over 400 kilometers from where they were made, and here is the detail that should make you think. Many of the Langdale axes found at distant sites show no signs of use. They were never sharpened, never swung, never used to fell a single tree. They were prestige objects, status symbols, gifts exchanged between communities to build alliances, currency before currency existed. And they were not alone. Pierre Petraquin and colleagues documented an even more spectacular trade network in continental Europe. Axes made from jadeite, a dense, beautiful green stone, quarried from sources at Monteviso and Monte Begua in the Italian Alps, were distributed across all of Western Europe from roughly 5,500 to 3,500 BCE. Some of these jade axes are exquisitely polished, almost luminous, clearly never intended for practical use. They were objects of power, markers of status, symbols that communicated something about the person who owned them, the way a gold watch or a luxury car communicates something today. The axe was not just a tool, it was an idea. And that idea, sharp edge, wooden handle, controlled force, had become so central to human life that owning the right one told the world who you were. Now, pollen records. This is where the axe stops being a personal tool and starts reshaping the entire planet. Palynologists, scientists who study ancient pollen preserved in lake sediments and peat bogs, have documented a dramatic transformation across Europe starting around 6000 to 4000 BCE. Tree pollen, oak, elm, lime, drops sharply. Cereal pollen, grasses, crop plants, rises just as sharply. Weed pollen explodes. The forests are being cleared and replaced by fields. The Neolithic elm decline, a sudden collapse of elm pollen visible in records across northwestern Europe around 3800 BCE, was initially attributed almost entirely to farmers and their axes, though researchers now think disease and climate played a role too. But the axe-driven clearing was undeniable. Europe's forests did not just thin out by accident. They were cut down, on purpose, by people holding polished stone axes to make room for the wheat and barley and cattle that would feed the first farming communities north of the Alps. Without the axe, the agricultural revolution in temperate Europe would have been dramatically slower, or possibly impossible. The axe was not just a tool of the Neolithic. It was the prerequisite technology that made the Neolithic possible. You could have the seeds, you could have the knowledge, you could have the livestock. But without something that could cut down a forest, you had nothing to plant them in. And then someone figured out how to melt a rock, and the axe changed again. In September 1991, two German hikers named Helmut and Erika Simon were walking through the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy when they spotted a body emerging from the glacial ice at 3,210 meters elevation. It was not a recent death. The man in the ice had been dead for approximately 5,300 years. They named him Ötzi, and he was carrying a copper axe. Ötzi's axe is one of the most complete prehistoric tools ever found. The handle is yew wood, about 60 centimeters long. The blade is trapezoidal, roughly 9.5 centimeters, made of nearly pure copper, 99.7%. Bound to the handle with leather strips and birch bark tar. In 2017, Gilberto Artioli and colleagues at the University of Padua published lead isotope analysis in PLOS1 that traced the copper to ore sources in southern Tuscany over 500 kilometers from where Otzi died. Someone mined the ore in central Italy, smelted it, cast the blade, and traded it north across the Alps. 5,000 years ago, a supply chain stretched across half the Italian peninsula for a single axe blade. And here's what matters about Otzi's axe for the story of this tool. The blade was smelted, not cold hammered from a chunk of native copper, smelted, extracted from ore by heating. That means the community Otzi belonged to had already figured out that if you heat certain rocks hot enough, metal drips out. And if you pour that metal into a mold, you can shape it into anything you want, including a blade for an axe. Copper is soft. Softer than a good flint blade, honestly, but it does not shatter. You can resharpen it endlessly by hammering the edge, and it can be cast into shapes that stone cannot hold. Otzi's axe was a transitional object, sitting exactly at the boundary between the world of stone and the world of metal. 5,000 years later, we are still on the metal side. Bronze came next. Mix copper with about 10% tin, and you get an alloy that is harder, holds an edge better, and can be cast into complex shapes. Early bronze axes were flat axes, essentially metal copies of the old stone forms. But bronze casters learned quickly that they could do things stone could never do. They added flanges, raised edges along the sides of the blade to prevent the head from splitting the handle on impact. They developed palstaves with a stop ridge and a loop for binding, and eventually they invented the socketed axe, with a hollow socket cast directly into the head to receive the handle. The handle fit into the axe instead of the axe sitting on top of the handle. Every one of those innovations was a refinement of the same original problem: how to keep the head on the stick, and every one of them worked better than the last. And then iron. And iron changed everything, not because iron was better than bronze, early iron was often worse, but because iron ore is everywhere. Copper is relatively accessible. Tin, the other ingredient in bronze, is geologically rare and unevenly distributed. Bronze Age civilizations built intercontinental trade networks just to get enough tin to make their tools and weapons. When those trade networks collapsed, around 1200 BCE during the Bronze Age collapse, the ability to produce bronze weapons and tools collapsed with them. Iron replaced bronze because iron ore is one of the most abundant elements in the Earth's crust. You did not need a trade route stretching from Cornwall to the Levant. You could find iron in your own backyard. And that democratized the axe in a way nothing before had. Suddenly, everyone could have one. Not just the elite, not just the connected, everyone. The iron axe was the tool that built the medieval world. It cleared the forests of northern Europe for the second great wave of agricultural expansion. It shaped the timbers of every wooden ship, every longhouse, every church steeple. Every Viking longship, those flexible clinker-built masterpieces that crossed the North Atlantic, began as a tree that someone felled with an iron axe. And the Vikings understood this better than anyone. For a Viking, the axe was not a secondary weapon, it was the primary one. Swords were expensive prestige items that most people could never afford. Axes were what people actually owned. They chopped firewood with them. They built houses with them. And when enemies came, they fought with them. The Dane axe, the classic two-handed Viking broadaxe, had a wide, thin blade, sometimes over 30 centimeters across, on a handle roughly 120 to 150 centimeters long. It could split a shield in a single stroke. It could hook a rider off a horse. The Bayeux Tapestry, made in the 170s, shows English huscarls wielding Dane axes at the Battle of Hastings in 10,066, forming a wall of steel and ash wood against Norman cavalry. The bearded axe, the skegox, had an extended lower edge that hooked downward below the handle. That hook could catch an opponent's shield rim and wrench it aside, opening a gap. The Mammen axe, found in a Danish grave at Mammen in Jutland, dates to roughly 970 CE and is inlaid with silver wire in elaborate scroll patterns. A weapon and a work of art in a single object. But the axe did not just build and destroy, it meant something. Almost every civilization that used the axe turned it into a symbol. The Roman fasces was a bundle of rods wrapped around an axe blade, carried before magistrates as a symbol of authority and the power to punish. The word fascism derives from fasces. On the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization used the labries, the double-headed axe, as a dominant religious and political symbol from roughly 2700 to 1450 BCE. It appears carved into palace walls, painted on pottery, cast in bronze as votive offerings. The word labyrinth may derive from labres, the house of the double axe. The tomahawk, originally a stone-headed axe used by indigenous peoples of North America, became one of the most desired trade goods when Europeans arrived with iron versions. The word comes from the Algonquian tomahawk, and the trade axe, a small iron hatchet produced in European workshops specifically for the North American fur trade, became a kind of currency in itself, exchanged for beaver pelts across an entire continent. Now, there is one more thing about the axe that matters more than any battle or any felled tree, and it connects back to the question you came here with. The axe is a composite tool, two or more different materials joined together into a single functioning system. A stone head, a wooden handle, binding, adhesive. Each component is useless on its own. A stone head without a handle is just a heavy rock. A handle without a head is just a stick. The binding without both is just a piece of string. The axe only works when all of its components are present and assembled correctly. And that requirement, that every piece has to come together in the right way, tells us something about the mind that built it. Miriam Hadel at the University of Tübingen developed a system called cognograms, diagrams that map every cognitive step required to produce a tool. A simple Olddown chopper requires a handful of steps. An Acheulean hand axe requires more, maybe 10 or so. A hafted axe, with its shaped stone head, its prepared handle, its adhesive, its binding, requires dozens of steps across multiple separate manufacturing sequences, some of which have to be planned days in advance. The adhesive has to be prepared before the assembly begins. The handle has to be selected, cut, shaped, and dried before the stone head is mounted. The stone head has to be shaped to match the handle, not the other way around. Every step depends on knowing what the final product will look like before you start. That is not instinct, that is planning. That is holding a mental template of something that does not yet exist and working backward from the finished image to figure out what needs to happen first. Thomas Wynne and Frederick Coolidge at the University of Colorado have argued that the cognitive demands of composite tool production overlap almost completely with what psychologists call enhanced working memory, the ability to hold multiple streams of information in mind simultaneously and manipulate them. Lynn Wadley argued the same thing from a different direction through the compound adhesives at Cebudu. Marlise Lombard at the University of Johannesburg has called composite tools a key behavioral marker of cognitive modernity in early Homo sapiens. The hafted axe is not just a tool, it is a cognitive threshold. Its existence tells us that the person who made it could think the way you think, plan the way you plan, hold a complex, multi-step production sequence in their head, and execute it over hours or days. The axe did not just change what humans could do. It tells us what humans had become. So, how did humans invent the axe? Here is the answer, and it is clearer than you might expect. The axe was not a single invention. It was at least 4 major inventions stacked on top of each other across roughly 1.7 million years. First, the Acheulean Hand Axe, a shaped stone gripped in the palm, invented by Homo erectus roughly 1.76 million years ago, probably in East Africa. That design lasted, essentially unchanged, for over 1.5 million years. Second, hafting, the act of attaching a stone head to a wooden handle, which required adhesives, binding, and multi-step planning. The adhesive technology existed by at least 200,000 years ago, Neanderthal birch bark tar, and compound adhesives for hafting tools appear at Cebudu Cave in South Africa by 70,000 years ago. Third, edge grinding, the technique of sharpening a stone edge by rubbing it against a grinding surface. This appeared at Madjedbeeb in Australia by 65,000 years ago, predating its appearance anywhere else by over 30,000 years. Fourth, metal, copper smelting by at least 5,300 years ago, followed by bronze, then iron, each one making the axe harder, sharper, more durable, and more widely available. The probability that the axe evolved through this specific sequence, from handheld stone to hafted stone to ground edge stone to metal, is effectively 100%. The archaeological record across multiple continents, dated by independent methods, confirms every stage. The only debate is about the exact dates of the transitions and whether specific populations invented hafting independently or learned it from contact with others. But the overall arc, from fist-held rock to handled tool to ground-edge blade to smelted metal, is not disputed by any serious archaeologist working today. And here is the part that should stay with you. The word axe itself comes from the Proto-Indo-European root aguasi, which is related to the Latin aces, meaning edge. It has cognates across almost every branch of the Indo-European language family. Old English ax, Old Norse ox, German axt, Latin ossia, Greek axon. The word is as old as the language family itself. Before the speakers of Proto-Indo-European scattered across Europe and Asia, before they became Greeks and Romans and Germans and Celts and Persians and Hindus, they had a word for axe, because they already had the thing. And the thing had already been in human hands for so long that nobody alive remembered a world without it. Tomorrow morning, somewhere on this planet, someone will swing an axe into a piece of wood, maybe a logger, maybe a carpenter, maybe a homeowner splitting firewood in the backyard. And the tool in their hands will be made of steel and fiberglass and polymer grip tape. But the principle, a weighted edge on a handle, swung in an arc to concentrate force on a single point that has not changed in 65,000 years, maybe longer. The materials have changed, the engineering has changed, the principle has not. A sharp edge, a long handle. Swing it hard. The person who figured that out did not leave a name. They left something better. They left the tool that built the world.